alias El H o Prada, líder principal de la barredora. ¿Te crees muy inteligente?
In recent months, Americans across the country have been getting a series of strange phone calls that have, unbeknownst to them, put them in direct contact with one of the most dangerous criminal enterprises on the planet, the CJNG Cartel. Each of these unsuspecting Americans have one thing in common. They own a timeshare in a resort town in Mexico. But as the infamous criminal group, who also goes by the name the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, has not only expanded its territory outside of the Jalisco state, it's also diversified its business operations outside of the world of smuggling. In fact, it now operates an elaborate scam targeting Americans that is more profitable than drug running, and there's almost nothing law enforcement can do to stop it. Before we get into the scam itself, first it's important to get some background information on the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, also known as the CJNG. The group started as an offshoot of the Sinaloa cartel, arguably the most powerful cartel in Mexico, but under the leadership of the mysterious El Mencho, whose real name is Nemesio of Seguera Cervantes. They've gone to war with the Sinaloa cartel and anyone else who threatens to get in the way. Operating out of a remote compound, El Mencho uses his hyper-militarized private armies to enforce their brutal brand of narco rule.
Now, a new and even more dangerous player has entered the scene. El Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJNG.
When they come into an area, they really come in really hard and heavy, meaning they will go in and start on a killing spree.
Polo Ruiz, Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Drug Enforcement Administration in Arizona, says the CJNG is ruthless in their quest for money and power. They now control 24 of Mexico's 32 states, with the firepower to back it up.
But what really sets them apart is their ruthless mode of doing business.
So with the Jalisco Cartel, for example, everybody knows about the hyper-violence. Everybody knows about El Mencho being hidden away in his hidey hole in Jalisco Cartel for the last 10 years. Everybody knows about their battles with Sinaloa all across Mexico. What people did know, was what we try to address in the book, is they have a unique modus operandi. They're a completely unique cartel. It's never been seen before in Mexico.
That's investigative journalist Chris Dalby. Chris Dalby is the author of CJNG, A Quick Guide to Mexico's Deadliest Cartel, and currently the director of the World of Crime think tank.
They don't do business sustainably, right? They draw every drop of blood from a rock in the areas they control. And that was out there. You had reports on them exploiting the tequila industry or the cattle industry or the avocados, most famously. When you put it together, you have an economic extortion map that's never been seen in Mexico. I mean, they willingly drive people out of business and then replace them with their operatives, right? They're not looking for a sustainable status quo like the Sinaloa cartel mostly.
Though they started by trafficking and selling drugs, the CJNG launched elaborate offshoots in an effort to diversify their earnings.
When you're looking at a cartel, you can't just look at a cartel as a bunch of hyped up drug traffickers, right? Cartels have different specialities. People within them have different jobs, and it all contributes to a very profitable enterprise, like a multinational company, right? Why is McDonald's the franchise that it is today? If you look at McDonald's, you have to study its history, the way it expanded, the economic climate in America and in the world that allowed that expansion. It's the same with the Jalisco Cartel. The Jalisco Cartel begins in the hills of Michoacán with a family of avocado farmers called the Valencia. The Valencia at the time are these very wealthy, they control huge tracts of land, and they begin to diversify in the 70s into marijuana and then into opium popping. But they're not interested in being a cartel at the time, or they haven't thought about that. They're just selling their marijuana, they're selling their poppy to bigger groups in the north of Mexico, right? They're middlemen, so to speak, they're wholesalers. Progressively over time, they get more ambitious, they get wealthier, they get the connections to begin operating as a cartel, to move their own drugs into the US. After the fall of the Guadalajara cartel, so luck happens, they're on the west coast of Mexico, they have control of ports. Pablo Escobar comes calling and says, hey, I need new partners to help me move my cocaine into the US, right? So they're the second generation of Mexico traffickers that moves cocaine into the US. What does that allow them to do? To diversify, to start setting up US operations, to start setting up money laundering operations. That anchors the next stage of the cartel where they become this national player. I'll spare you 20 years of Game of Thrones back and forth and power struggles within Mexico. That's 3 chapters of the book. But they end up subservient to the Sinaloa cartel. They end up with they lose their territory in Michoacan. They're forced into exile to the north, and they go to work for El Chapo. Power struggles within the Sinaloa cartel. El Mencho comes to the forth as this very ambitious, hyper-violent narco who was in California in the 80s during the meth boom. And suddenly he goes, well, hang on a second, there's a big hole in Mexico for synthetic drugs. There's no one in Mexico that has our knowledge of how to make meth, later fentanyl, and that has our control of Pacific ports, that has our knowledge of drug trafficking routes to the US. So they become the synthetic experts, right? They're not born from this generation of CJNG leaders doesn't have the connections to the marijuana and the opium. They're pure synthetic boys. They go back into marijuana and opium, of course, because that's where a lot of the money is, but they really become the first synthetic drug experts, right? And then they seem to see Mexico as Napoleon would see a map of Europe. They see a land ripe for conquest. And so they move into states almost in a military fashion, right? They'll put up narco banners in half a dozen to a dozen municipalities, identifying by name the local criminals that can either get in line or get shot. And then they will act on that promise and they'll take over that state. That's a way of expanding that Mexico had never seen before. The legacy of that is 80% of all cartel murders in the last 10 years were either committed by or done to the Jalisco cartel. That's an astonishing statistic in a country where there's so many criminal groups. They're connected to 80% of the cartel violence in the last 10 years.
As the CJNG expanded its territory, it also expanded its business model, moving from trafficking drugs to elaborate criminal enterprises that involve everything from theft and extortion to human trafficking. And if the cartel recruited new business partners who didn't want to participate in their crime, they took violent action to ensure the next recruits wouldn't make the same decision. Border Patrol Agent Chief Victor Manjarres witnessed their expansion and violent tactics firsthand as power shifted from the Sinaloa cartel to the CJNG.
Since then, the dynamics for the Mexican cartels have changed quite a bit on that. So when you look at the Sinaloa cartel, often known as one of the meanest, most violent in the whole bit. Not as much, though, as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. They're almost in every state, and they're ruthless, but they changed the business model. It used to be narcotics, but they're almost like, I know McDonald's is not going to appreciate what I'm going to say right now, but it's like McDonald's, the corporation, franchising a McDonald's store. And so local business, hey, I want to be a McDonald's owner, so I'm going to get a franchise McDonald's. And on McDonald's, I get their branding. I get the commercials, I get the branding, I get some certification. Well, that's what they've done. They got into commodities, they get in, now they're into oil, they're in avocados, they're in timeshares, they're in all sorts of things. And they're also into extortion. And so what they do normally is they move into an area. The place I've been looking at a lot has been Guanajuato, one of the states in Mexico. And so there was a group called, it was a gang, Santa Rosa gang. And the Santa Rosa gang was punching holes into the Mexican government oil pipeline, pumping, siphoning the oil, gas that comes through, and then selling it in the black market. Or selling it to gas stations and say, you're going to buy from us, as opposed to selling. So they're making that money. And so they were doing extortion. So the new Jalisco cartel came in and said, hey, we like your business model. Why don't you work for us under our brand? They went to the boss, and the boss said, no, we're happy. Okay, so they put a bullet in his head, and then they went to the deputy and said, hey, we're going to give you the same offer. He just saw what happened. He goes, hey, you know what? That sounds like a good offer. We will work for you on that. And so they got the branding from the Jalisco cartel. They got the protection. They've got weapons. They got resources they needed. And so the business models changed.
As the CJNG expanded its operations and regional influence, It moved into resort areas, where the primary revenue wasn't generated from drugs, but from Western, mainly wealthy American tourists. In those areas, members of local criminal groups would steal or illegally sell databases of information about Americans who had purchased timeshares in the area. For those unaware, a timeshare is essentially a piece of property on a resort that many people collectively own. They each pay a fee every year in exchange for being able to use the property during a predetermined window of time. The only problem is, many timeshare owners don't end up using their property very often, and will later want to sell them to offload fees associated with owning them. However, the timeshare business, especially since the pandemic, has created a tough market for people wanting to sell their properties. That's where the CJNG came in.
So I'm going to go back in history a little bit. Prior to 2010, for a number of years, there were kind of sole operators that had their own call centers, and they had information either stolen or leaked, or they bought these databases from hotels that had timeshares in the city of Puerto Vallarta.
That's Steve Fisher on a recent episode of Change Agents, an Ironclad original. He's an investigative reporter based in Mexico City who covers organized crime in Mexico for outlets including the New York Times, USA Today, Washington Post, and LA Times.
Then it became an extraordinary business, but everyone kind of on their own and stuff. And they had these call centers, and they were scamming individuals in the United States who owned timeshares in Puerto Vallarta. In 2010, there was one particular individual who had a call center. And this is according to, information provided to me by the U.S. government. And he was within the Jalisco Cartel, and he said he came to someone within a position of power in the Jalisco Cartel and said, "You guys, you can make so much money on this scam." And they bought the idea and basically went around to all these call centers and either threatened the people working at those call centers that they would have to work for them, or just simply took them out and took over the call centers. And what the Jalisco Cartel did with the teaching of, being taught by this individual who had brought them the idea in the first place, was like train individuals to scam Americans, primarily senior citizens in the United States. And they brought in people who have, and I've listened to audio of these people, who speak almost perfect English. And they have them set up a network of shell companies and essentially LLCs through which they say, we are this business, you can look us up, we have this. They have this sleek website, you can see here that we are this, we're a real estate broker. And what they tell these the people on the phone, the people they're trying to scam, often people over 60, for the reasons that you mentioned, they consider them a more vulnerable and more lucrative option. They say, "Look, you have a timeshare. I see you have a timeshare here in Puerto Vallarta. I see that you paid $50,000 for it. And I'm a real estate broker, and I have someone who would love to buy it from you for $75,000. And that sounds amazing, because it's really difficult to get rid of your timeshare once you've bought it."
Using the stolen databases of the timeshare owners' information, the cartel-run call centers would contact elderly Americans and make them an incredibly generous offer for their property. The only catch, the caller would explain, is the American timeshare owner would first need to pay a series of international fees and logistical costs to unlock the money. But the scam expands beyond the phone calls. The Americans on the other end of the calls even sent paperwork that all looked very official.
They have this really great website that shows what they do and who they are. And in fact, they have very, very good legal documents that they send them. They say, "Look, here's the legal document, here's the agreement, here's the contract, all of it, everything signed." Everything is in order. It looks in order. I mean, some of these people I've spoke to who were scammed even brought them to their accountants and said, "Does this look okay?" And they're like, "Yeah, it looks legit. Let's go for it. Wow, congratulations."
Once they've convinced the American timeshare owners that they were representatives from legitimate buyers, the elaborate, extended fraud would begin.
I mean, this is like extraordinary, the levels, the layers of fraud that they engage in. And so they say, look, $75,000, right? But first, it's this whole thing in Mexico. There's this federal tax that you have to pay before, you're in the United States. There's this like cross-border tax. It's like a whole equivalent IRS kind of tax that's required. It's a specific law. I can send you the article within the tax law that shows all of this and stuff. And they're like, oh yeah, sure. And they're like, it's going to be about $3,000. And here's a document that shows this law. This is from the tax agency. I have it now because, of course, you signed this contract. So please just send $3,000 and we'll send you your $75,000. And in fact, once it's all said and done, and once the owner that wants to buy this has actually bought property, you will be refunded everything that you owe. So that's how it begins, with these smaller numbers. And they, over time, it's like, they're like, well, look, there's this new thing, there's this new tax. And then they're like, oh, we just sent the check via FedEx. And if you think about it, right, a check in Mexico is probably not going to be cashable in the United States. But still, we send a check and it's held up at the border because it's more than $10,000, which you can't bring more than $10,000 in cash in the United States. So there's just this fee to allow them. And they go on, and it's like a drip scam, drip defrauding of American senior citizens. And in my story for USA Today, I write about a man that I met who, over a period of 12 years, and more specifically, spent the most in the last 3 years, he was defrauded of $1.8 million.
Even once the American victims realized that they were getting scammed, the cartel timeshare centers still found ways of defrauding them of even more money. Here's Steve Fisher, again, discussing what happened to an American financial planner and timeshare owner once he caught on to the ruse.
Officials are warning of a widespread cybersecurity attack.
Frustrations and delays have continued as countless are still without power.
Market volatility is at its highest since the pandemic.
There are a number of reports across the state.
An unidentified cracking news. There is no doubt our grid is at risk.
But the shark is taking seriously.
What happened with him was it started out to be one thing, and here's where this cartel is even more sophisticated. Once he caught on to this scam, he was like, oh, you guys are scamming me. They just dropped off for a few months. And then someone called him and said, hey, we're from the Victims Defense Institute of Mexico, which is a legitimate organization. We just raided a call center and found your information and saw that you've been defrauded of an enormous amount of money. And we have a lawyer who is prepared to bring your case to the Supreme Court. But not only that, your name has been used to defraud other individuals. So you are due all the money that those other individuals, that your name was used to defraud. And it's to the amount it ended up being of $6 million. But here's the thing, we're just gonna need some fees because there's these fees for the Attorney General's office. There's a fee for the Unit of Financial Investigations, again, totally exists. There's all these documents, and his case goes to the Supreme Court for at least 2 years. It's in the Supreme Court, during which he's like paying lawyers and paying all these fees because now, way back when he was owed, he was going to get paid like $75,000. Now he's about to recover all of the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had already spent and make $6 million. Oh, is that meaning, get $6 million? That's how they pivot when they identify that you realize you've been scammed, right?
With another scam.
And he kept record. He spoke to more than 150 different individuals, many of them who purportedly were from the Mexican government over a period of 12 years. And he built close, deep relationships with some of them. They knew intimate details about his life. What he didn't know is that it was the Jalisco cartel scamming him of, again, more than $1 million, almost $2 million. And this organization is now expanding. So they started out in Puerto Vallarta, and had some call centers in the city of Guadalajara. But they now have more, and this is from the US government, they now have more than 24 call centers across the country. And they're going into Cancun and taking over the market, the timeshare market in Cancun. And the US government told me they are now making so much money, to your point, it's hundreds of millions a year. And that's a super conservative number. But they're now making so much money that the return on investment is greater than drug trafficking itself for the Jalisco cartel, one of the premier drug trafficking cartels in the world. Scamming senior citizens in the United States is now more lucrative than drug trafficking.
And as the CJNG eyes further expansion, they're employing the same violent methods that got them where they are today. Many timeshare workers don't seem to have much of a choice when it comes to whether or not they will be involved in the scam. Steve tells the disturbing story of 8 employees who tried to refuse to do cartel work.
Like many things in Mexico, it's hard to know exactly what happened, but it seems that there may have been an internal revolt. And they may have tried. One of the theories is that they may have tried to leave their jobs and get out. And that theory basically suggests that their bosses made an example of them in a way that the Jalisco cartel knows how to do very well.
Authorities now believe the CJNG is operating on both sides of the southern border, though most of their members are still based in Mexico. However, with these phone scams, they've found ways into Americans' actual homes, and the threat they pose to Americans continues to grow.
The scary thing about this is that the Jalisco cartel has now found its way into the living rooms of of America's most vulnerable population. And it's hard to overstate that. Not only are they in their living rooms, they have their social security numbers. They have everything to identify them. They can go pay them visits if they want. They've threatened to have them arrested and extradited to Mexico for not paying the Mexican tax. Like, there's so much. They know how many homes they have. They might know their entire wealth. There is so much that the Jalisco cartel now knows about American senior citizens. It's terrifying.
These scams and the reporting of journalists like Steve and Chris serve as a reminder that though drug trafficking poses a direct threat to the borderlands of Mexico and the United States, when it comes to their reach, you can never be overly vigilant. My name is Vince Vargas. Thank you for watching Reasonable Fear, a Borderlands special series in Ironclad original. Be sure to check at This Is Ironclad on YouTube for more from this series, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.